Welcome back for this new live session to talk about the role of natural gas assets in the transition from fossil fuel-centric to low-carbon energy and economic system. I will now pass the floor to the Senior Thematic Analyst Energy, Green and Sustainable Hybrid Depths at Natixis, Ivan Pavlovic.
Yes, good morning all. So I'm pleased today to be with you to discuss the potential role of natural gas assets in the transition towards a low carbon economy. When we talk about gas assets, we refer to a broad set of assets extending beyond the mere gas value chain, which encompasses not only the infrastructures enabling transport, extraction and transport of gas from wells to end users, but also to the downstream uses of gas, in particular power generation, which currently makes up for 40% of present-day uses of gas. Another key point to highlight for the sake of our discussion is the fact that along with gas markets gaining international dimension over the past 3 decades, the various uses of natural gas have expanded in various activities. Natural gas is indeed used either as a fuel or as a feedstock in activities as varied as power generation and heating, the production of steel, cement, chemicals, hydrogen, but also the propulsion of engines in transport. Also of note is the use in the manufacturing sector of gas at the expense of coal, for the provision of adjustable levels of process heat for industrial boilers and furnaces. So in the recent past, over the past 5 years, the place of natural gas in contemporary energy and economic systems has become a highly debated topic for 2 reasons. The first one is obvious. It has to do with the growing climate change awareness as evidenced by the signature of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Let's recall that as part of this agreement, the main objective the country signatures now are pursuing is to hold the increase in the global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So there is a broad consensus in the scientific community about the need to reach climate neutrality by 2050, followed by negative emissions thereafter. So in practical terms, what this means is that for the world to become climate neutral by that date, it needs to drastically reverse the trend in carbon emissions from last year's 34 gigatons to 0 in the next 30 years. Given our contemporary energy systems' high, over 80% reliance on fossil fuels, namely oil, coal, and natural gas, what has to be achieved is actually a drastic reduction in the use of these primary energy sources, which emit CO2 upon combustion, and therefore consume the world's carbon budget. Second, in a related manner, the role of natural gas is highly debated because while being a fossil fuel, natural gas is less CO2 intensive than oil and coal. Indeed, natural gas is 30% and 45% less CO2 intensive on average than oil and coal. So looking from the angle of CO2 emissions upon combustion, you could argue that natural gas is by far the least harmful of all fossil fuels. However, things are not that simple. Depending on how gas is extracted, can be by conventional drilling or by hydraulic fracking, and transported, can be by pipelines or by ships in a liquefied state. Natural gas can be responsible for significant climate externalities, taking the form of CO2 and, worse still, methane emissions. For methane is a very harmful greenhouse gas with a much higher warming potential than CO2. So indeed, in the various parts of the value chain, natural gas is responsible for the emission of methane emissions, albeit to varying degrees. All in all, undertaking this life cycle analysis of gas reveals that in a vast majority of cases, natural gas remains preferable from a climate standpoint to coal and oil. Indeed, according to the International Energy Agency, gas remains less climate harmful in 98% of the cases for coal and in 95% of the cases for oil. So gas being less climate harmful than coal and oil, in most instances, is often cited to promote the vision of natural gas and natural gas assets as key enablers of energy transition. From the perspective of the climate neutrality target by 2050 I mentioned earlier, this vision raises two intertwined issues. The first issue is that being less climate harmful than oil and coal, natural gas can provide clear climate benefits. However, these benefits always have to be sensed in light of the specific context in which the use of natural gas occurs. So in other words, natural gas displacing more CO2 emittive fossil fuel is not by nature a distinctive feature of energy transition. Let me just take the example of the recent trends in Saudi Arabia's electricity mix. What we see is that the increased use of gas at the expense of oil has indeed reduced the sector's carbon intensity, but has not taken place into an overarching climate neutrality strategy by the kingdom, and has indeed served as a way to strengthen the country's oil-centric business model. Second, there is a fundamental ambiguity in relation to the concept of energy transition, because the concept describes both a process, namely the gradual decarbonization of existing fossil fuel-centric economic and energy systems, as well as an endpoint, namely the achievement of climate neutrality by 2050. So in light of the elements above, the key climate benefit of gas as a molecule lies in its use to actually displace coal whenever possible, especially in such sectors as power generation and manufacturing. So being more carbon intensive than gas, but also being more widely used across geographies and sectors, coal remains the main source of worldwide CO2 emissions as a primary source, with a share of 44% in 2017 versus 21% for natural gas. In the power generation sector, coal continues to be the dominant fuel, accounting for 36% of worldwide generated volumes in 2019, whereas natural gas only enjoys a share of 10%. So for the sake of illustration, holding all else equal, substituting gas for coal in present-day power generation systems could avoid the emission of 15% of the carbon dioxide that was released in the atmosphere in 2019. So in more practical terms, this is in Western Europe, where energy transition policies are most advanced, but also where the use of lignite and coal for power generation continues to be widespread, that the role of natural gas as a transitional bridge fuel is best evidenced. Through the use of flexible power generation units, generally referred to as gas peakers, gas assets have been actively accompanying the development of CO2-free intermittent sources. Being able to swiftly respond to peak demand, but also to substitute for missing production for solar and wind generation sources, natural gas-fired plants act as system backup. This role is getting all the more crucial as countries such as Germany and Spain now rely on solar PV and wind sources for power generation in the magnitude of 30%. So such reliance proves increasingly challenging in the face of the absence of economical large-scale solutions for energy storage. Better still, in addition to accompanying the development of renewable energies in the decarbonization of Western European electricity mixes, natural gas assets can act as key enablers of systemic coal phase-out policies. Well, the abundance of gas-fired generations and their enjoying very low utilization rates have been one of the key enablers for countries such as the UK, Italy, or Germany to a lesser extent, launching massive systemic coal phase-out policies in the power generation sector over the past 5 years. It is all the more important to mention this role that these countries had been thus far heavily relying on coal for power generation. So all in all, in some specific instances, what we see is that gas and gas assets can help trigger a decarbonization process through the phase out of coal. However, if we now analyze the role of gas and gas assets from the angle of the ending point of energy transition policies and initiatives, that is carbon neutrality by 2050, the role of gas and these assets in their present uses can only be limited. Unless carbon capture and sequestration processes, namely referred to as CCS, that are currently under development are scaled up and eventually massively deployed in the coming years, there is limited room for the current uses of gas in a low carbon economy. However, there is a key distinction to be drawn between the gas molecule on the one hand and the underlying gas infrastructures on the other hand. Interestingly, the EU taxonomy under development acknowledges such distinction. While it sees most present-day uses of gas for power generation, manufacturing, and mobility mostly incompatible with a low-carbon economy, it also stresses the role natural gas infrastructure assets can play in the development of low-carbon gases such as biomethane and green hydrogen. While indeed, both gases are increasingly perceived as potential substitutes for natural gas, given the climate benefit they offer relative to the latter. As in the case of biomethane, the climate benefit relative to natural gas is indirect. biomethane is a near pure form of methane, mainly produced by upgrading gas, which itself results from the anaerobic transformation of organic raw materials. So while its combustion emits CO2 in the same proportions as those from natural gas fire sources, its production allows the removal of greenhouse gases, mainly CO2 and methane, that would have been otherwise released in the atmosphere upon decomposition of the raw material that is used as feedstock for biogas production. On the other hand, when produced through green-powered electrolysis, the type of hydrogen referred to as green hydrogen offers direct climate benefits relative to natural gas. This is because, as you know, hydrogen emits steam rather than CO2 upon combustion. While emerging, these gases offer new avenues to accelerate the decarbonization of the world economy. First, being an almost perfect substitute for natural gas, biomethane can be safely injected and stored in existing gas infrastructures. As such, biomethane is increasingly seen as a key lever to decarbonize the residential uses of natural gas, namely cooking and heating. On its part, green hydrogen offers a potentially much wider decarbonization potential for the economy. When used as an energy carrier and/or as a feedstock in such sectors as power generation and heating, mobility, manufacturing, green hydrogen has the potential to displace nearly all the current uses of fossil fuels. From a technical standpoint, the only limitation hydrogen as a molecule currently displays is that it can not be safely injected in excess of 10% and 20% for transmission and distribution networks. So, but the interesting thing to mention here is that such limitation is very unlikely to be felt in the near future and won't probably be felt before 2030 and 2035. So in the perspective of an effective energy transition from fossil fuel dependent economies to low carbon economies, biomethane and green hydrogen could be seen as a sort of missing link after the essential but insufficient step that the coal phase out represents. However, being in their infancy, both molecules need to be substantially scaled up for their production costs to go down and ultimately to converge towards those of natural gas. This is precisely where existing gas infrastructure assets can have a valuable role and ultimately preserve an economic value in an economy having successfully transitioned towards carbon neutrality. So looking at gas infrastructures, in particular networks, one sees that they share a few technical features, placing them as perfect allies of low carbon gases. But first,
Ivan, we will have to ask you to conclude, please.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, I think the key message is clearly that gas infrastructures can be perfect allies to low carbon gases, and eventually they will help transition the overall economic systems to a low carbon economy. And I think that the key point in the use of existing gas infrastructures towards a low carbon economy is that at this stage, these existing gas infrastructures offer an almost free option to scale up biomethane and green hydrogen, and ultimately to integrate these low carbon gases into a systemic and cost optimized pathway towards carbon neutrality.
Thank you very much, Ivan Pavlovic. Thank you. Sorry for this interruption, but we have actually to be on time as we are live. Thank you, and we'll move on now to the next live panel discussion with 4 panelists and 2 moderators, and the theme will be Europe's energy system integration and the development of hydrogen. I just would like to remind you again to do not hesitate actually to ask your questions on the box, on the interactive discussion box on the right-hand side of your screen. So now let's move on to our live session and introduce the panelists. We have Guillaume De Smet, Vice President managing the Hydrogen Energy Works business unit at Air Liquide and actively involved in Hydrogen Council. Hello to you. Dominique Maucly, President and Chief Executive Officer at Terega. Samuel Morillon, Chief Executive Officer at Siemens Energy France. And finally, for the panelists, last but not least, James Patterson, Head of Acquisition and Investments at ENGIE Hydrogen Business Unit. And we have two great moderators, Sybille Grand-Georges, Director Industry Banker Power at Renewable Infra at Natixis, and also Antoine Trieux, Mid and Downstream Group Head at Natixis. Hello to everybody. The floor is yours, Sybille and Antoine.
Thank you, Christina. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning. And after the opening words of Christina, I would also like to welcome all of you, so a distinguished speaker and audience, to this very much awaited panel on hydrogen. Hydrogen, well, we stand at the new dawn for the entire world energy sector. And hydrogen is set to be key to that evolution. As efforts to cut carbon emissions become more urgent every day, the part played by hydrogen in the transition to a low-carbon economy looks set to grow significantly. Hydrogen is abundant as an element and has a great potential as a zero-emission fuel. In fact, pure hydrogen produces no carbon dioxide nor any other harmful emissions when burnt or converted into electricity. So that is the good news. The bad news, though, is that the production of hydrogen today is still far from being green, as it heavily relies on natural gas and coal. Also, there is a lack of infrastructure, which has restricted the use of hydrogen so far beyond the oil and gas and chemical industry to niche applications in vehicles and small power plants. We believe that this is changing, and this is changing fast. It is changing because there is a powerful and rising emphasis on decarbonization, which is driving renewed interest in carbon-free and green hydrogen produced using electricity from renewables. It is also changing because on the policy side, and more particularly at EU and member state levels, there is a tremendous growing interest in hydrogen. The German government has pledged 9 billion euros over the 2020-2030 period to boost its green hydrogen economy. In parallel, the French government has just unveiled a very ambitious 7.2 billion investment plan over the same period, 2020-2030, with the joint focus on the production of green hydrogen, but also on the spreading of its uses in hard-to-abate sectors such as heavy-duty mobility. We trust that the journey to green hydrogen is already underway. And the production and use of hydrogen are at crossroads. In that context, some key questions emerge. Are the recent industry and policy developments game changers for the industry in Europe? What are the development prospects for the sector on the continent? To discuss these questions, we are privileged and honored to have with us some very distinguished representatives of leading industry players of the hydrogen sector. And to start with, I would like to ask one question to all our panelists, a very simple one. Why hydrogen? And why do you see hydrogen playing an important role in the energy transition, and what role your organization is willing to play in that trend? So the very same question to all our panelists, and maybe to start with, I'll start with Guillaume to answer that question.
Yes, thank you very much. I will take the opportunity to thank the organizer. Maybe a quick insight on who we are. Air Liquide is a global industrial gas company operating in 80 countries. And our business is to produce and deliver essential small molecules to our customer. And one of this molecule, in fact, happens to be for at least 50 years hydrogen. Today, we have a turnover of about 22 billion euro per year, and hydrogen is about 10% of this turnover. So we produce and we deliver to a variety of customers over 1 million, about 1.2 million tons of hydrogen per year already today. So that's a molecule we know very well for the industrial usage. In parallel, for years, we've been developing the application of hydrogen as a way to decarbonize several usage like mobility and now increasingly the industry sector. As a founder of the Hydrogen Council, that's in a way underpin our vision on the role of hydrogen going forward in the energy transition. We joined and we co-founded the Hydrogen Council in 2017, and later this same year, in November 2017, the Hydrogen Council released the first systemic scenario showcasing the role of hydrogen in a low carbon economy. And it ended up with hydrogen playing a role fulfilling about 20% of the energy demand in 2050 in a 2-degree scenario, with a more than tenfold increase in its usage in terms of energy units. Now, about 3 years later, what we observe is that we have been joined in this vision by many organizations. I will just quote the last two scenarios I have in mind, the one by the Energy Transition Commission and the one by the International Energy Agency earlier this year, that end up more or less with the same amount of hydrogen to be used in 2050 if we are to be serious about decarbonizing our economies. We see primarily a role for hydrogen in industry and hard-to-abate mobility sector, which is heavy duty, on-road and off-road, and a share of lighter duty or medium duty when you have intensive case. The role we see for us, in fact, it's an extension of what we do today. It's serving end user with decarbonized, low carbon or renewable hydrogen, delivering it to the customer in a safe and efficient manner, cost competitively, focusing on the sector where we have really a legitimacy thanks to our technology portfolio, which is heavy industry, medium industry, and heavy mobility. And I think I will stop there. I think it's time to pass the floor.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Dominic, you're heading Terega. You've written a book on the role of gas in the transition. What role do you think hydrogen is going to play in the energy transition in Europe?
So, as I said in the book, but I think we all think that since many times, hydrogen will play an important role in the energy mix. Doesn't mean it will have all the room. It will have a big room in this mix. And what is happening today is that it's just speeding up, and at the same time, some rules are put in place in order to make things happen in the areas of industry where it has already a place, but the place is gray hydrogen, and now it will become blue and then green, etc. But in parallel, we will have also development in mobility, as it was said before, and all of that will make hydrogen a bigger element in the energy mix. From what we see as a network, so as a service provider for gas transportation, could be biomethane, could be methane, could be hydrogen in the future, it's clearly that we have to think now how our infrastructure can help the development and take part of that. So from our own position, what we've seen today that the first element which we will participate is the transportation of this kind of new gases with our existing infrastructure, because it will help first, let's say, make the gas greener, but also allow using the actual infrastructure to develop a service which is a cheap service to transport the hydrogen. The second one will be storage, because storage is necessary if you go to producing hydrogen in particular in a green way, because it will be linked with some energy being produced by renewable systems, so you need some storage somewhere. And the third element on which we play is that hydrogen has a key role to play in interconnecting systems. It's also already something we do today when we develop power-to-gas systems with our, let's say, the other transporters, etc. But in the future, hydrogen will be something that will allow easily to connect electricity to gas systems generally. So syncing to a global energy network in which some energies are playing together in order to optimize production and consumptions. It's also a key element for hydrogen. So in summary, hydrogen is becoming more and more important in the future. The existing infrastructure will have to evolve, but there is a room to use them in order to transport, store, and the interconnection with system will also develop, and it's where we want to play.
Thank you, Dominic. James, you're working for ENGIE. ENGIE is a leading institution in the energy transition. ENGIE has a unit dedicated to hydrogen. What role do you see ENGIE play in the future in the development of green hydrogen?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes?
Yes.
Hi, great. My video seems to have cut off from the panel, but hopefully you can see me as well. So yes, so at ENGIE, we see renewable hydrogen as being at the forefront of the transition towards a carbon neutral economy. This is confirmed by our chairman and recent public statements on our strategic refocus. We see the potential for renewable hydrogen to decarbonize manufacturing and heavy transport and provide a solution for seasonal power storage. In the long run, renewable hydrogen can unlock the potential of renewables by providing an efficient way to store and transport its intermittent power. But power to power as an industry for hydrogen is still a while away. And ENGIE sees its role as finding industrial scale hydrogen projects that are possible right now. Costs are not going to come down until somebody starts building large scale electrolyzer facilities. This will in turn drive more and more automated mass production of electrolyzers at cheaper costs. So this is why we focus now on converting some of the 70 to 80 million tons of grey hydrogen produced annually to green in industries such as ammonia production today used as fertilizer, perhaps tomorrow also as a shipping fuel, and other industrial applications including refineries and steel production. And we're also very interested in heavy mobility projects, which are economical now without subsidies. So our strategy is to find long-term offtake contracts for green hydrogen with early adopting clients in places with cheap renewables and ideally subsidy support schemes, and establish ourselves as a pioneer in industrial scale projects, which is so important as a first step in bringing costs down in the long run. We see our role as taking the first step in the chicken and egg demand story. Once our clients start producing, for example, green ammonia, biomethanol, we expect demand to increase for these products globally, driving more projects, resulting in more cost reduction, and then more demand under a virtuous cycle. In the longer run, this includes transportation and storage infrastructure required to support the industry, which will only be built if green hydrogen is produced economically and at scale.
Thank you. Samuel, you're the CEO of Siemens Energy France, a leading provider of technology for European energy system. What role does Siemens intend to play to foster the growth of green hydrogen?
So first of all, thank you for the invitation and for the discussion. It's tremendously interesting what we are sharing right now. What I would say is first, the hydrogen topic is not really new for Siemens. We have been working on this topic for years. But there is, all the time, there is one driver. It's the amazing passion we have regarding this topic. And this passion, we can see it through a solid experience we do have right now on the entire value chain, which touch the hydrogen topic, from the production of green energy with wind farms, with solar farms, until the power generation by itself with turbines able to run with hydrogen today. This experience we do have concerning the entire value chain give us, I believe, two guidelines I would like to share with you. First, according to what James shared just before, we need to think big. We need to think tremendously big regarding the hydrogen topic. The world is changing. We are right now engaged in the energy transition. and we should not focus on testing, experimenting, let's say, small solutions. The time is right now to scale up. And what we believe in our company is that we need to address large-scale projects to be able to create really an impact on the market for the decarbonization. This is the topic number one. The second topic, and this is also something we do have in mind in our organization, is that it will take time. It will take time because we need to build the entire value chain. When we are speaking about hydrogen today, we need to have in mind that in Europe, probably in the US, in Asia, we do not have schools providing studies and trainings regarding hydrogen. There is no supply chain to bring the hydrogen safely in different key points in the streets, in the cities, and elsewhere. We need to develop the maintenance around new jobs we will have to develop around this topic. So we need to think big, and we need to think long term. And the idea right now is for us to support our customers in this transition with industrial projects, with large projects to create really an impact. And it is, for example, to be less theoretical, this is currently what we are doing with ENGIE, by the way, with the support of the European Commission in France, with a project named iFlex Power for SmartFit Kappa, where we are implementing at an industrial scale a 20 megawatt solution to decarbonize a factory producing recycled paper.
Thank you, Samuel. Very interesting example. I think every week, almost every day, there are announcements about projects for green hydrogen. But the reality is today, 99% of hydrogen produced is gray hydrogen produced from hydrocarbon. Guillaume, according to you, what are the obstacles to the development of green hydrogen?
Yes, thank you. Okay, coming back, first, this challenge is part of a wider challenge, or a set of wider challenge, which is first to decarbonize our economies at the right pace. We want to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. We cannot afford taking years to wait, to develop, to test new technology. We need to scale up now the technologies that will be needed at scale in 2050 to achieve the carbon neutrality objective and to keep the climate at the increase of temperature at a level which is manageable. For hydrogen, it boils down to a set of sub-challenges, which are, in fact, to scale up the application of usage for the new usage, mobility in new industrial usage, like hydrogen to reduce iron ore in steel. It was mentioned the conversion of distribution assets, which might go in some countries with the conversion of appliance to use hydrogen to provide heat and power. So this is the demand part, to scale up the demand of hydrogen for the new usage, to decarbonize, to realize its role in the energy transition. In parallel, you have to scale up the production of low carbon hydrogen, and renewable hydrogen is one of the components of the low carbon hydrogen supply that we see in the future. So that's electrolysis. Today, electrolysis is a technology that exists. Basically, it's a one century old technology that was developed in the first half of the last century. And we have seen large electrolyzer plants, like over 100 megawatts, operating usually on dams, so already on renewable power, for the fertilizer industry. So it's not new. There are new technologies that are now commercially mature, beyond the usual technology, which exists at small scale. As a gas producer, today, most of the hydrogen we produce, the 1.2 million tons I mentioned, actually comes from very efficient large-scale SMRs. But still, we own and operate about 40 electrolyzers at customer sites when it makes commercial sense. So this is a technology that exists today at small scale. It's being scaled up. Clearly, as Air Liquide, we are taking our share in this. We started up in 2017 a 1.2 megawatt electrolyzer in Denmark that runs on the Danish power which is made a lot with wind power. So to test the ability of a larger scale electrolyzer to manage fluctuation in the grid. We are currently executing, and the startup, the industrial production will start in a few months, the largest PEM electrolyzer in Quebec, in Bécancour, for industrial and mobility usage. That will also be green hydrogen running on renewable electricity. And the next step is really to scale this industry. When you look at the plan announced, European strategy, it's 40 gigawatts, German, France, Netherlands, it's always somewhere between 4 and 7 gigawatts by 2030, starting from an industry that delivers not yet at this scale. So it's really the main challenge. It's to build the industry, to deploy the first project, which most likely will be, and that's what we are working on, at the 100 or 200 megawatt size, to accompany the scale-up of the industry. And to build this scale-up, what will be really required is a demand for the molecule. So a clear policy framework, a clear regulatory framework for the use of green hydrogen and of low carbon hydrogen, and the development of new usage, so good articulation of the deployment of production, the deployment of the reconversion of infrastructure, and the scale-up of demand centers. So that's really clear. If we take an example, wind power, which is one of our offshore wind, which is a good analog in some respects. In 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the largest wind farm was 500 megawatts. Today, it's 3.6 gigawatts. So that's an example of how an industry can scale. And it's interesting to look at this number because if you talk large industry, heavy industry for a refinery, the typical size of a hydrogen source will be 100,000 cubic meters per hour. That's 500 megawatts electrolysis capacity. If you run it on the intermittent electricity sources, which has, let's say, a 30% load, it means you have to multiply by 3 and be above 1 gigawatt or one refinery. So it gives an idea of the challenge we have to face. And really, we need to accelerate the deployment of new usage, to build a source of growth for this molecule, to be able to secure the investments in the new production plant for green hydrogen, which will in return secure the build-up of the industry and the supply chain.
Thank you, Guillaume. Yes, indeed, I think there is a need to scale up the industry, and this will not happen without a proper regulatory framework to push the growth. Dominic, in your view, what type of policy support is needed to foster the growth of hydrogen? Is it the CO2 price, subsidies? What is the right type of policy support needed?
First, I would like just to emphasize that we are in a very specific period. There is a strong political commitment. This is the first time, I think, in the history of Europe that on energy, there is a sort of commitment between France and Germany, but also among the other players, where we have chosen a technology that we aim at developing all together. So the first element is there. So this is the first brick. This brick is interesting because if you look at the various policies developed between the various countries with the aim of having a decarbonization of industry or having more green mobility, etc., you see that, for example, in Germany, they better push some blue hydrogen. In France, they better push green hydrogen. But all of that goes the right direction. It means they will focus on all the elements of the supply chain from the production up to the usage, with an aim which seems to me the same for everybody. It still needs to be, let's say, probably a little bit more detailed, but everybody wants the hydrogen to be at a cost that will allow the various players to be competitive, and it's the aim of part of the subsidies that will be put in place. So the first brick which exists, which has been put in place, has been, it's my guess, well thought by all the governments, even if they spoke together, not exactly as much as they could, but it's good. The second element is that I just take an example. In the southwest of France, where we have our networks, we already have some producers thinking at developing renewable from solar panel, and they want to inject some hydrogen into our network. There is no regulatory framework to develop this kind of project. So we are urging the regulator and the market to try to develop the regulatory measure that will allow us to inject, when electricity is not produced, to inject this hydrogen in order to be allowed to use this hydrogen in economic conditions that we know. The other element that you mentioned, which is also clear, is that all this hydrogen economy at the first step needs to, let's say, to be helped by the CO2 price. So CO2 price is something which is led by the market. If you want to speed up and allow the industry to develop scaled things, as it is mentioned, and we fully agree that it's not going to small project that we need now, it's really to scale up the system. You need either to push the CO2 price to a level which is, let's say, above 50 euro in any case, and between 50 and 130 according to the conditions you want to develop. And you see that in the northern part of Europe, they already play and develop business plans according to that. So in order to develop the necessary investment that we will have to make on the various steps of the supply chain, we need a CO2 price incentive somewhere.
Yes, very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Policy support will be key to scale up the industry. We start from a very low base. Samuel, how long do you think it will be before hydrogen will play a meaningful role in such sectors as mobility, electricity production and storage, industrial processes?
I can only give you the opinion of a technology provider. What we see is that it will take time. It will take time if we start now. Because as we just discussed before, we need to build the entire value chain. It means that we need to have industrial and engineering capabilities and capacities in the countries. We need to implement them, and we need to develop everything, the entire project, and this takes time. On top of this, we need also to cover the territories. It's one thing to do one demonstrator in a city. It's another thing to implement and to develop, to scale up everywhere in a country. On top of this, as it was mentioned by Dominic, there is a key topic regarding the governance rule, the standardization and the regulation. And for this, to be able to build at the end the business case, the business models, we need to have visibility regarding the price of COX. This is absolutely key. And we need also to have a legal framework helping us to start and to motivate, let's say, our customers to initiate projects. So what we believe is in the mobility area, it should start around 2025 and will increase until 2030. And in this area, we have a lot to do. Just to give you one figure, in Paris right now, we have one H2 bus comparing to the 6,000 H2 buses in Shanghai, in China. So a lot to do, and it will take time. In industry, we believe that we should also have an increase around 2025 up to 2030, 40. So basically minimum 1 decade. And in the power area, which is also a very important, let's say, domain, it will, we believe, take between 5 to 10 years. To come back on this power sector and the power area, this is absolutely key to underline that H2, the green hydrogen, will not fly if we do not have enough power capacities in the countries. If you do not have enough capacities, you don't produce green hydrogen. You produce brown or blue or whatever hydrogen, it's not a green one. We need to increase production, energy production capacities in order to be able to switch properly from the economy where we are to the future and economy we want to build together. So this will take time. And what can we do to speed up? Again, I believe we need to do 4 things, pretty simple. First, as I mentioned before, we need to think big. And I believe this is key. We need to think at the industrial scale. as it was mentioned by colleagues from ENGIE and Air Liquide, we need to work on large projects. Second thing, we need to think global. We should not reduce the production of hydrogen to electrolyzer or to technology. We need to see globally the value chain of the green hydrogen. And for this, also this means the involvement of the public authorities, but it means also to have a consensus in the private area. Third point, we need to have clear business cases. And for this, we need to have also visibility regarding the cost of CO2. This is absolutely important. And last point, to make this happen, and this is really good that we have here colleagues from different companies, and you, Natixis, we need to work together. We need to work together. And my dream could be that in a couple of months, we sit together again and with a project in our hands. This is how we will start. We need to act as entrepreneurs and work together to make this happen.
This is what we hope to finance all the green hydrogen projects that you will come to us with.
You're welcome.
James, we've heard about the time is going to take years. So in your view, you're a gas player, and is a gas player and a renewable player today. What will be the articulation with other energy sources? What will be the role of hydrogen alongside the energy sources in the EU mix?
Sure. So clearly, renewable energy is the key to climate neutrality, and we expect to see its share of the energy mix in Europe to continue to grow rapidly. We at ENGIE, of course, expect to contribute to this growth, as evidenced by our recent increase of our target for renewable capacity, commissioned from 3 gigawatts a year to 4 gigawatts a year on average over the medium term. But to truly unlock the power of renewables, need to address their intermittency, of course, and find an efficient way to store and transport the energy produced. And in the long run, hydrogen can do this much more efficiently than batteries, particularly when you need to store higher amounts of energy for longer periods of time. And additionally, as mentioned previously, there's a huge potential to convert the existing production of grey hydrogen and industrial uses to green hydrogen, and powering this conversion will require huge amounts of additional renewables infrastructure. So clearly, we expect the renewable share of the mix to grow rapidly. Petroleum and solid fossil fuels will, of course, in turn decrease as a share in the mix over time, particularly as renewables and hydrogen solutions become cheaper and emitting CO2 becomes more expensive. You mentioned that we're obviously a big player in gas. Natural gas will perhaps take a bit longer to reduce in this mix in the long term. Blending and pipeline injection with green hydrogen is something which is underway, including in our projects, for example, in the Netherlands, where they have additional motivation actually in that jurisdiction due to the expected depletion of gas fields in the nearer term. But generally speaking, there are many barriers here. Maximum viable blending rates within existing transportation infrastructure are still largely unknown, although being tested by us and others. And infrastructure on distribution networks like gas turbines would need to be converted. Other infrastructure sitting on the network would need to be replaced. And in fact, for many pieces of infrastructure sitting on the existing network, an alternative to natural gas is not possible. So in my view, gas will remain a significant contributor to the energy mix in this transition period. Then blue hydrogen, which is not the focus of ENGIE, carbon capture, probably does have a role in the transition, and that will somewhat slow the reduction of fossil fuels in the energy mix. But at ENGIE, we currently focus on renewable hydrogen as we see it becoming more economic than blue hydrogen in a relatively short time frame.
Well, thank you, James. I think also in the audience we have many infrastructure funds which are part of this, which are very keen to hear what you have to say this morning. And one question I'd like to ask you is, what role do you see them play in this whole new ecosystem? How do you see them intervene in this new economy of the hydrogen? So maybe I'd like to ask this question to Guillaume first, and let the other ones intervene if you have any.
You mean how we see
the infrastructure funds? Yeah.
Yes. In fact, we see an important role, in fact, for finance provider. An example of this is the fact that the Hydrogen Council has opened its membership to financial organization, because we feel that beyond the dialogue between the industry and the policymakers, there's a need, in fact, to have a trilogue between the industry, the policymakers, and the finance world. Given the scale of the infrastructure that has to be funded in order to enable this transition, be it in the production side, in the distribution side, or in the refueling network side, you have a lot of infrastructure investment to do, and it needs to be secured. In fact, any investment will need some kind of certainty, especially in these uncertain days of the transition, where we know we are entering a long journey. We need each player has to secure itself and to secure the others, and by moving all together, policymakers, industry, and finance sectors, it's the right way to build the coalition of willing that will secure the deployment of hydrogen application. So typically, we see a bright role, and there are initiatives to develop or to co-develop a joint work between infrastructure funds and the industry.
Thank you.
To finance.
Yes, and any particular asset class where you would see them be more relevant? I mean, maybe James, you can give us a bit of insight on that within the hydrogen value chain, of course.
So, I mean, let me start by saying that, you know, obviously infrastructure funds will be extremely important in the long term. This, you know, we see this industry as becoming huge and therefore having huge capex requirements, which needs to be supported by financial partners such as infrastructure funds. If we talk about projects now, which I would say are at the smaller end of industrial scale, perhaps there's a little less need for these phase one projects for additional equity. But of course, I see and we all see the value that infrastructure funds need to bring in the future. And we understand, of course, that funds need to educate their LPs and get them to position for the future. It's not like one day in 5 years, all of a sudden, when these projects become much larger and larger, that there will automatically be demand there from infrastructure LPs. So we understand that it's crucial to get them involved now on these projects to start that education process, so that they can be well positioned in terms of raising funds for this asset class in the medium and longer term. Perhaps I would say the asset classes within, or the uses within hydrogen that are going to be more palatable to infrastructure funds are, of course, the ones that are more economic, such as heavy mobility. As I said, probably is quite economic now and doesn't actually need subsidies. But then, of course, other industries such as chemical feedstock projects, where you have all the pieces in place in places like Europe, with the subsidies there to support the projects.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. We have actually to move on to the questions. Thanks a lot for your insights. Let's check now the questions. And again, you can ask some questions on the platform right-hand side of your screen, the interactive panel discussion session. So I will ask now the first question that we have received: to what extent the existing gas transportation network is usable to transport hydrogen? What are the main capex to be made, and what are the main associated difficulties, and over which period of time? That's a long question. Maybe Dominique, yeah.
Yes. So so this is work on progress, I would say, but there is some figure that you should have in mind. So mixing methane and hydrogen, for example, is something which is feasible in the current infrastructure. There is a first threshold, which is easy because it's already mandatory, and part of the specification is to allow 2% of hydrogen to be part of our infrastructure. Then there is a second threshold, which is close to 10%, where in fact you need to check a certain number of element valves, let's say compressors, stations, etc., in order to check that in fact the material you use is comfortable with between 6 and 10% of hydrogen. And this needs, let's say, some capex, but not so many capex, because the current compressor we buy, for example, are already specified in order to be compatible with hydrogen, etc. So it's not a process we are just discovering. But nevertheless, you need to check many aspects to be sure that what you will propose to the market is, in terms of danger, does not present any danger to the environment or to the people who use it. So up to 10%, it's a first step. And then there is another step. The other step is also linked to the distribution networks. So it means, what do you do with this mix of hydrogen and methane, and are the equipment you use in your house or in the industry compatible with increasing the level of hydrogen into your methane? So in terms of volume of capex, I would say up to 10%, it's something which is rather low capex. Then the second wave, I would say, would be more capex. And above 20%, clearly 100%, so it means dedicated infrastructure will have to be developed. So it's another step, a longer one. The additional thing that you need to check is that mixing hydrogen and methane means that you will have to have these two elements into storage, so you need to check your storage facilities. So, but all of that is work going on now, and our guess is that typically by 2025, the calibration of those figures and the type of infrastructure that you can use or not use will be finalized, or let's say more specified than what I described now. But clearly, yes, we can use the existing infrastructure. What we need to do is in fact to check that we have taken all the parameters into our analysis.
Thank you. Next question. What is the price of electricity necessary to produce a viable and competitive green hydrogen? Samuel.
Oh, thank you for this very technical question. No, basically what I can share is cheap power is in the range between 20 to 30 euros per megawatt. So it means 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt. And this is enabled to produce, I would say, competitive green hydrogen, provided by a number of operating hours through the year. So renewable, in the renewable area, cheap power should be able to be achieved in North America, South America, Middle East, Australia, and this kind of countries, where we should be able to make it properly. Just to give you some figures. To give you and to take more an helicopter view on what we are sharing, right now, when we are investing in conventional power generation units, we used to say that to have 1 gigawatt of power, we need around 1 billion euro, around. If we want to do power to H2 power, let's say completely, we should reach 1.5, 1.6 billion for 1 gigawatt of power. This means a slightly more important value. And this means also, to come back to the first question you were sharing, this means the support definitely of the financial community to make this happen. So to summarize, we can be competitive in some areas with the H2. And second, to go through the CapEx issue, definitely we will have to consider, let's say, global investments with long-term investment supported by banks.
I think Guillaume wants to add something.
Yes, I would just like to add to this point the fact that you need to look, obviously, to look at the cost side of hydrogen, but also at the demand side. And it's a key question in the whole energy transition story. It's how you price the decarbonization. And the studies we've made show that, in fact, the target cost or the target price for hydrogen at the end use depends on the end use, because the value you provide in terms of decarbonization, either because you don't have other option to decarbonize these sectors like heavy mobility or the site also are not available. So it's really a two-sided equation. You need to look at the cost. Obviously, you need competitive renewable electricity. You need to decrease massively the capex of the electrolyzer. And at the same time, you need to price adequately the CO2 externalities in the different applications that hydrogen will decarbonize.
Okay, one final question that is actually a long question, but I will ask you to give a short answer. How do you perceive the recent announcements of a potential retrospective reduction in the solar FIT tariffs in France vis-à-vis the establishment of a stable regulatory framework to develop hydrogen in France? Maybe Guillaume or Dominique or Samuel? Samuel, you're ready.
Okay,
I'm ready. What I can share with you is that what is absolutely key for us is to, and for the community, I would say, is to have visibility and to think on the long term. Definitely, when you change a regulation, and you know this better than me, it's never good. It's never good because you don't know what will happen, and this brings some kind of turbulences. What we hope with the recent measures concerning the H2 topic, we hope that we will have for the next decade a long run with a long visibility, helping us to think big, as I mentioned before, to have a global view, to be able to be successful. And the solar is definitely not the best example I would take. I would prefer, let's say, to follow what is currently done by the French authorities concerning the H2 roadmap.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you also to our moderators. I would like now to close this morning's session by thanking all the audience that have been with us, and to remind you that actually it continues this afternoon. So our next panel will be on how does the COVID-19 crisis impact the development strategy in the renewable sector. It will be in about an hour and 10 minutes. And let me remind you a couple of things on the platform. Do not hesitate to go and network, get some meetings with some of the participants, or even to the moderators if you have any other further questions, obviously. And you have the replays of all the live session directly on the platform, and also a digital library with some interviews of experts, some recorded other panel discussions from other places in the world. So I invite you to join us in 1 hour and 10 minutes for the rest of the program this afternoon. Thank you very much again, and see you there. Thank you.